Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar that is sponsored by Awenza. And we are here to talk about the Clinical Trial Facilitation Group Q&A document about the reference safety information. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm going to give a short introduction, and then there's two speakers that will introduce themselves to talk about the document. A little bit about myself. As I said, I'm Sharon Kell, and I am trained as an internist and geriatrician. I started out in academic medicine for 7 years, and then I joined the pharmaceutical industry where I've been working for the past 23 years, and I've held positions at Novartis in medical affairs, Johnson & Johnson in medical affairs and clinical R&D. I've also worked at Impax Pharmaceuticals in clinical R&D, medical affairs, pharmacovigilance and drug safety, Amnio Pharmaceuticals, and my most recent position was at Prevention Bio in clinical development. And currently I am consulting. So with that, I will introduce the topic of interest. So as you know, in the clinical safety and PV world, the sensitivity and importance of the reference safety information, or RSI, segment of the IB cannot be emphasized enough. And needless to say, a comprehensive review of these guidelines is vital to the acquisition of the core concepts in the preparation of the RSI and the clinical development program for any investigational product. The RSI plays an important role during clinical trials. Therefore, authoring a compliant RSI addressing the safety concerns is critical. The CTFG Guidance Q&A document advises sponsors that the primary purpose of the RSI is to serve as the basis for expectedness assessments of suspected SARs by the sponsor for expedited reporting of suspected, unexpected, serious adverse reactions, or as you know, SUSARs as they are known, and annual safety reporting. Therefore, the RSI section of an IB should only contain expected SARs to the product. It also clarifies that a broader description of the safety profile of the IMP in addition to the RSI, that is non-serious adverse reactions, suspected SARs that have occurred only once, as well as fatal and life-threatening SARs that are considered unexpected and are not included in the RSI, but they should be included elsewhere in the IB. So in this webinar today, Sanjeev Miglani and Mugdha Chopra, who are co-founders and directors of Awenza, will talk in detail about this guidance in this context. And just a couple of housekeeping things up front. You're welcome, please, to post your questions during the webinar. We'll do our best to answer your questions, and in case we're not able to do that online, we will try to respond to you by email. And as well, the webinar will be available for download in a couple days. So at this time, again, welcome. And I'm going to hand the floor over to Sanjeev, who will introduce himself and is going to start today's presentation. Sanjeev?
Thanks a lot, Sharon, for moderating this session. Well, my name is Sanjeev Miglani. I'm MD in internal medicine, and Mugdha and I started Awenza Life Sciences 4 years back. So at Awenza, we are doing end-to-end pharmacovigilance, clinical safety, medical monitoring, and medical writing for our clients across the globe. And before starting Awenza, I was the Vice President of Pharmacovigilance and Medical Affairs at Apsar Life Sciences, where I was managing their US operations. And before Apsar, I was the Vice President of Pharmacovigilance at Accenture. And again, I was overseeing the pharmacovigilance and medical writing operations over there. And prior to my industry entry, I was a senior resident in cardiology and medicine. So I will now start the session on the CTFG guidance for RSI. And in this presentation, I'm going to cover the following topics. Well, I'll be talking about the purpose of reference safety information. I'll be talking about location and format of the reference safety information. I'll also be talking about the different kind of parameters that have to be taken into account while doing expectedness assessment, and of course, severity and specificity are the two most important topics that have to be taken into account. I'll also talk about the presentation of the safety information, how it has to be presented in the RSI, and my colleague Mugdha will talk about the procedure for update of RSI. She'll also talk about the amendments, how whether the amendment is considered to be substantial or not substantial when we are updating the IB, and during the follow-up receipt, how is that version of RSI taken into account. Well, first of all, I think the most important thing is what exactly is a reference safety information. Well, a reference safety information is primarily a section within the IB or within the SMPC, which is summary of product characteristics, if you're talking about a product which is also in the marketing phase. So the information which is expected is basically the reference safety information in a IB or the SMPC. Now, the CTFG guidance document very clearly mentions that if we are talking about the investigator brochure, and in fact, as Sharon also mentioned in the beginning, the reference safety information for IB is practically a list of expected serious adverse reactions, and they have to be classified using PTs according to the METRA. Of course, if we are talking about the summary of product characteristics, which is basically the scenario applicable for the products which are in the post-marketing, in that particular scenario, we can have RSI having serious and non-serious adverse events. But strictly speaking, if we are talking about the IB, there has to be a specific reference safety information section as per the CTFG guidance document, which should only contain the list of serious expected adverse reactions. And for practical purposes, whenever a clinical trial is conducted, and if we get any assays, so the assessment of the expectedness have to be done purely based on the RSA section. And it should be clearly called out what exactly is the RSA section. Like say within section 6, there could be a section 6.4, which could be called as RSI, we should have a particular format which is provided by the CTFG guidance, and I'll talk about that in one of my subsequent slides. And based on this particular RSA section, when we decide whether an event is expected or unexpected, so if we have any serious adverse event which is related, and tomorrow if we get any event which is unexpected, so if that particular serious adverse reaction is unexpected, so that will be considered as SUSAR, and that will be applicable for reporting to the regulatory authorities, like in the US and Europe. Of course, some of the countries may not require SUSAR, they may require all the assays, but wherever the SUSAR reporting has to be done, so the assessment of expectedness has to be based on the RSA section from the IB. And in fact, even for the preparation of the DSUR for practical purposes, the expectedness assessment is also used for the identification of SUSARs in the cumulative summary tabulation of the suspected SARs in the DSUR. So what all purposes are there for the reference safety information? So the CTFG guidance document clearly talks about the exact purpose of the RSA. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, the most important part is that this particular section of the RSI, this particular RSA section of the IB is meant for assessing the expectedness of all the serious adverse reactions that happen during the clinical trial. So this section should have a clear-cut list of those reactions in a particular format, and we'll be discussing about that in the subsequent slides. Now, a very important thing which CTFG guidance document mentions is that generally, as a rule, suspected SARs that have occurred once should not generally be considered expected unless the sponsor takes a decision that there is a strong causal association, and you have a strong D challenge which is positive, you have a re challenge which is positive, and maybe there is a good temporal association, and all the other factors are ruled out. Otherwise, the SARs which have occurred once should not be considered expected. Even for that matter, if we have some serious adverse reactions which have occurred even more than once, if we make a decision to put them as a part of the RSI, obviously there has to be a strong rationale and that rationale has to be given at the time of the RSI update. Let me take an example. Sometimes there can be situations where we know that drugs can cause some adverse reactions, say drug-induced liver injury, and maybe we have a classical scenario where Hy's laws is positive, wherein we have a classical elevation of SGOT and SGOPT, and maybe we see the pattern which is consistent with the drug-induced liver injury, where bilirubin is not significantly raised, but maybe it is still elevated in line with the positive Hy's laws. So even if we have a single case, at times there can be exceptional scenarios wherein we are able to rule out any other confounding factors. Maybe we know that, okay, the drug was given to the patient, there was a classical elevation of hepatic enzymes, and the moment the drug was withdrawn, the enzymes reduced, and then the moment the drug was given again, the hepatic enzymes increased again. So if we have a classical scenario wherein we know that this is something which is classically happening due to drug, in those scenarios, even if the SAR, if it is happening once, if the sponsor has a strong rationale, in those situations, a single SAR can also be included in the RSA. But otherwise, as a general rule, we should wait for more than one SAR of the same kind to be included in the RSI. And even for that also, we have to see whether the association is reasonable enough or not for including that in the RSI. Now, another important thing which we should all very clearly know is that the list of the expected serious adverse reaction should be based on the actual data that is coming from the human population, from the clinical trials, and it should not be based on the anticipated data based on the pharmacological data that we have or from the preclinical studies that we have. Of course, that data is always a potential risk. We always have to monitor that data. But when it comes to the RSA section of the IB, we have to strictly make this particular RSA section based on the data from the human population, from the clinical trials, and not from the anticipated properties of the drug. Well, a very important thing in addition to it is that the RSI has to take into account the nature, frequency, and severity of the expected SARs. In fact, I'll give some examples how this severity and frequency or specificity have to be taken into account when we are preparing the RSI section and when we are doing the assessment of the essays while we're getting the, when we're getting the cases, how we make use of these parameters in making the decision on effectiveness. Now, as a general rule, also we have to see that the IMPs do not cause fatal life-threatening reaction, but of course there can be scenarios wherein if we have a strong data to believe that yes, a particular fatal reaction is happening because of a drug, then those events can be included in the RSI as an exception. But in general, as a rule, fatal life-threatening reactions should not be considered expected in the RSI section, and whenever they are reported, they should be considered unexpected, and they should be considered as, and if there is a relationship, they should be considered as a SUSAR, and they should be considered for 7-day reporting as per the guideline. But yes, if there is already a assessment that has been done for a particular fatal reaction, say if we know that a particular drug is causing fatal rhabdomyolysis, and there is enough evidence to state that, so if we have a strong justification in exception scenarios, we can always capture them in the RSI, but otherwise we should not do any inclusion of fatal life-threatening reaction in the RSI section. Okay, so moving to the next point, which is basically the location of RSI in the IB. Maybe just one slide prior to that, maybe we can move to that. Okay, so for practical purposes, when we talk about the IB, so the RSI has to be a specific section within the IB, and this section can be clearly called out in the cover letter while submitting the IB, and even the DSUR, if it is being submitted along with the IB, the RSI section should be clearly mentioned, and we should mention about the list of expected SARs in the DSUR also, if both the documents are aligned. Now, one may say that what about the other safety information, which is not basically a serious expected reaction? Now, of course, that is also important, but that should not be a part of the RSI. So let me take some examples, like say if there are some known serious adverse reactions, or if there are some SAEs which are not related. Now, those kind of events can always be placed in some other sections, which could be summary of data and the guidance for the investigator, or there is a section on effect in humans. So that particular information can reside in that particular section. But again, the RSA section should always have the serious expected adverse reactions if we have a scenario where the RSA is in IB. Now, there can be a scenario wherein the RSI is basically the SMPC for practical purposes, because say the product is already approved and the sponsor decides that, okay, I will be using the SMPC for practical purposes, and then that RSI would be practically the section 4.8, which is the undesirable effects for that particular drug, and that would be containing both even serious as well as non-serious adverse reaction, which is absolutely okay if it is a post-marketing product. Now, if the investigation product has a marketing authorization in several member states with different summary of product characteristics, the sponsor should justify its selection of the most appropriate SMPC with a reference to the subject safety as the reference safety information. And the differences to the most recent version of an existing EU SMPC should be justified. Well, a clearly separated specific section within the IB may also be used as a RSI for an IMP within the terms of its marketing authorizations in the EU. Okay, now the CTFG guidance document also clearly mentions the format that has to be used for the RSI. So the RSI has to be presented in the form of a tabulation manner, wherein the nature of the expected SARs are required to be listed SOC wise, and the PT should be mentioned, followed by the frequency. And in case if the IMP is under development in different medical conditions, say you have a oncology indication and you might have some other indication which is not oncology related, so there is a provision to even provide separate tables for those expected SARs by indication if it is appropriate. So it's not a mandatory thing, it is a decision that the sponsor should take depending on the risk profile of the drug. If we understand that probably that the expected SARs are different, then we can take a decision to even have two different RSIs within the same IB, and the SARs can be mentioned separately in these two tables if we think that yes, there are two different indications for which the drug is being developed, and we think that the SARs, the risk profile is different for the two different indications. Now, similarly, while presenting the RSI section within the IB, the frequency of the expected SARs have to be presented. Now, this is something almost similar to section 4.8 SMPC. Like most of you would have seen the section 4.8, you would have seen that the SARs or the adverse reactions for practical purposes are captured as common or very common or uncommon. Now, if there is a particular serious adverse reaction which is happening in the frequency from which is more than 10%, so that is considered to be very common. If a particular SAR is occurring in a frequency between 1 to 10%, it is considered to be common adverse reaction. And if the frequency is say between 0.1 to 1%, it is uncommon. Now, even for practical purposes for RSI, when we are creating for the IB, the same frequency methodology can be used, and the same percentage or the range can be used to determine if a particular SAR is common or uncommon or rare or very common. And there can be scenarios where the data could be quite limited, because sometime in the early stage clinical development program, in the phase 1 studies or early phase 2, there could be very insufficient number of subjects who are exposed to IMP. So in those kind of scenarios, the number of the actual observed suspected SARs for each expected SAR can be provided together with the number of patients exposed. Now, another important point is that, and in fact, I mentioned about that earlier also, if there are any fatal and life-threatening suspected SARs in the RSI, they should be only, captured if there is a strong causality. Generally, as a rule, fatal and life-threatening SARs, fatal and life-threatening SAs which are reported, they should not be considered expected. If there is a strong rationale that there is a fatal and life-threatening serious adverse event that is reported, and the sponsor believes that yes, it is related to the drug, and now we have multiple events coming from the same kind, then yes, a decision can be taken to capture that in the RSI. But otherwise, these kind of fatal life-threatening reactions should be captured in the other sections, which could be either the section on summary of data and the guidance for the investigator, or there can be a subsection on safety under effects in humans. Now, this is a typical format. Again, this has been taken exactly from the CTFG guidance document. Now, if you look at the table, it gives some events like diarrhea, increase ALT. Now, for each and every serious adverse reaction which becomes a part of the RSI table, first of all, it is based on the MEDRA, like these are the preferred terms, not the LLT or the verbatim. Each of the PTs have to be classified under the SOC under which they fall. And then we have to mention for that event, in case if that is a fatal life-threatening expected SAR. Now you can see an exception to the rule, that life-threatening SAR as an exception to the rule has still been classified like myocarditis, maybe because there was a strong causal association and it was captured as a part of RSI. But otherwise, the other events, they were not considered to be a fatal life-threatening expected reactions. Now, say, if you look at the incidence or the frequency of diarrhea, there are, say, 25 subjects. So this means that you have 25 subjects who had diarrhea, which is a small n, and the capital N is the total number of subjects who have been exposed to that particular product or the investigation medicine product in the entire clinical development program. So of course, when we are talking about the RSI, this is not for a particular clinical study, it is for the entire clinical development program for that particular IMP. And if you have, say, number of subjects exposed to a particular IMP across all the clinical development program till a particular data log point, and this will include all the phase of the studies, say phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, whatever have been done for that particular IMP till that particular data log point. Say if you have total number of patients exposed are 328, and if you have 25 number of patients who have experienced diarrhea, so it means that 25 divided by 328, which is 7.6. So that's basically the percentage. And if something falls between 1 to 10%, as I mentioned, so this will be classified as a common SAR. Now, if something is falling between say something which is equal to more than 10%, like myocarditis, so this would be a example where you have a SAR which is very common. Again, this is just a hypothetical example taken from the CTFG guidance document, but that's how it should look like. And in fact, the European authorities are very, very particular about the format of the RSI. They clearly expect that the RSI section should be clearly mentioned. Even if you don't have any SAR, you can always call it out that, okay, this is a section, but even if it is blank, you can always mention that and call it out categorically. But when we are creating a table for the RSI, it should have a format which is exactly given in the CTFG guidance document. Now, I would like to spend some time on this particular topic, which is the role of specificity and severity in the expectancy assessment. And this is very important because even though when we give the definition of unexpected event as per SIOM's guidance or as per ICH E2A, the definition is that any adverse event, the nature, severity, and the specificity of which is not consistent with the information given in the RSI. If it is not in line with that, the event is considered to be unexpected. Now, this definition seems to be quite simple, but it carries a lot of weightage. And there would be, of course, an interpretation of specificity every time when we get a particular SAE during the clinical trial. Similarly, when we have the event, we have to see whether the severity of that particular event is in line with the RSI information or not. Now, let me take some couple of examples here. Say if a patient has developed interstitial nephritis, but our RSI in the IB just mentions acute renal failure. So since interstitial nephritis is quite specific, this would be considered unexpected because of the specificity of the information. Similarly, sometimes the anatomical specifications would basically play an important role in deciding whether a particular a serious adverse event, if reported in the clinical trial, would be considered expected or unexpected. Say in our RSI, we just have the term arthritis, but the patient with whom we are dealing with is having temporal arthritis. Now, that is more specific based on the anatomical specification. So, because arthritis could be across any part of the body, but if we have something specific, say temporal arthritis, that becomes unlisted. Or sometimes the histological specifications are there, but they may or may not make the impact. Now, maybe, and again, this is a classical example given in SIOM's guidance document, SIOM's 5. Say if somebody is having hepatic necrosis as a diagnosis, and our RSI has hepatic necrosis as a listed SAR. Now, within that report, biopsy report, the diagnosis is mentioned as hepatic necrosis, but you might have some element of neutrophilic infiltration along with eosinophilic infiltration, which could be a part of the biopsy report. But that would not make a huge difference to the overall diagnosis. If the overall diagnosis is hepatic necrosis as per the biopsy report, and if our RSI section of the IB mentions that as a listed event, so that event would still be considered as an expected event. Now, there can be scenarios where there could be similarly more specificity. Say if our RSI mentions stroke or cerebrovascular accident as the SAR, but in our patient, we get to know that the cause of the stroke is cerebral thromboembolism or maybe vasculitis, which is more specific. So in that kind of scenario, again, the SAR would become unexpected. Say if our RSI says hepatitis as the only listed SAR in the GI, but our patient had fulminant hepatitis, which is quite severe form of hepatitis. So again, that would be more severe and thus more, this would be unexpected. Similarly, if we have hypertension only as a listed SAR in the RSI, but our patient had malignant hypertension or hypertensive crisis, that would make the case unexpected. Sometimes the duration also is very important. Maybe sometime when we are having the RSI may just mention that there is a transient rise in the liver enzyme. And of course, when we are having any RSI, those decisions would have been taken based on the SARs that would have been received from that clinical trials in the past. And maybe the only information which is there in the RSI, to take an example, is transient increase in the liver enzymes. But the patient with whom we are dealing with, or the SAE that we have got, maybe that has chronic cholestatic injury, or maybe rise in hepatic enzymes persistent for a couple of months. And obviously, that is a more severe form, and the duration is more. So in that scenario, again, the event would become unexpected. So it's very important that whenever we are dealing with these kind of serious adverse event, when they come to us, on case-to-case basis, we have to take a decision. And of course, that's the reason we do the follow-up. We try to get more and more information so that we can get more specific information, because this happens multiple times. When we get the SAE, sometimes the only SAE information that comes to us at the initial report itself is just say stroke. But tomorrow, when we start doing the deep dive, when we start asking the follow-up questions, we get to know, okay, it was an embolic stroke. Now, of course, the entire story changes because embolic stroke is not something which is already mentioned in the RSI. And based on that specific information, that would become unexpected. And if that case is considered to be related, so that would become a SUSAR. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very important that when we are assessing the cases, first of all, we should try to get detailed information as much as possible so that we can make a correct decision on the assessment of the expectedness. And when we make that decision, then we get to know whether that case is SUSAR or not. And accordingly, a decision is taken to report the case to the regulatory authorities as applicable. Now, again, I'll take another example. If our RSI just says exfoliative dermatitis in the RSI, now that is obviously not a severe form. And if we get Stevens-Johnson syndrome or say erythema multiforme in our patient, which is much more severe form, so that would become unexpected. Or say septic shock in our patient, if we are getting, would be unexpected if the term that is mentioned in the RSI is sepsis. Similarly, say if our RSI says arrhythmia, but our patient is having atrial flutter or atrial fibrillation, which is a more specific form given in the case that we are dealing with, so that would make the case as unexpected. So these are some examples, and again, every time the case has to be interpreted based on the merit of the case, and we have to take the decision based on the actual information that we have got in a particular essay which we are receiving at any given point in time. Now, CTFG guidance document also mentions how should the expected SARs be listed in the RSI. Now, it clearly mentions that, first of all, only the MEDRA preferred terms are allowed. So we cannot have scenarios wherein we can just capture any verbatim term or any LLTs. So it is strictly preferred terms that have to be captured in the RSI section. The other thing is that there can be scenarios wherein we can have some kind of infections which are mentioned in the RSI, and we know that maybe a drug is immunosuppressive, and maybe the only term that is mentioned is infection, which is quite non-specific. And when we are getting the essays, they are, say, more specific in terms of the content or the narrative that we are getting. It is more specific. So if the only term that is mentioned in the RSI is infection, we cannot take that as expected. It will be considered unexpected because of the nature of the kind of infection. Say if you're getting cytomegalovirus infection because it's being caused because of the profound immunosuppression. So it will not just become listed just because the term infection is given in the RSI. Also, a suspected SAR should be considered unexpected unless the PT is listed as an expected SAR in the RSI. So, and again, it's given in the CTFG guidance document. For example, if urticaria is not included in the RSI, the occurrence of an individual case of urticarial rash SAR should be classified as a SUSAR. Now, the safety information which is not required to be included in the RSI of the IP, and I gave some examples earlier also, but let me clearly demarcate what all should not come in the RSI. The thing that is very clear is that only the expected serious adverse reaction should be a part of the RSI. Now, what are the other things which are important but may not become a part of the RSI? There can be adverse events which could be serious or non-serious, but they are not considered to be related by both the investigator and the sponsor. And again, when we are making a decision on the preparation of the RSI, it's not that we are just kind of taking the decision from the investigator and then make a particular decision on inclusion of the SARs in the RSI. At the end of the day, it's basically the sponsor decision or the PV team's decision who is working on the behalf of the client. When we are doing the signaling on a quarterly basis or maybe at the time of annual IB update, when the overall analysis is done, so at the end of the day, if that decision is taken that, okay, that serious adverse event is having a causal association and there are more than one SARs, then that can be taken in the RSI. But otherwise, like if there are SAs which are not related, and if whether they are serious or non-serious, everything would go into the other sections, which could be either the summary of data and the guidance for the investigators, or it can fall under effects in humans, which is a separate section. Even the fatal life-threatening reactions, again, unless like we have taken a decision that as on an exceptional basis we are including in the RSA, otherwise, as a general rule, they would go into the other sections. But if you're talking about any particular SMPC, of course, in SMPC, the serious as well as non-serious reactions, they will all go in section 4.8. Other than that, the life-threatening reactions, again, if they are not expected, which is generally the rule, they will go into the other sections. Now, if there is a SAR that has occurred just once, and we think that, okay, right now we just need to monitor because obviously there is no strong causal association at that moment, again, that would go into the other sections and not in the RSI. There can be situations where deaths or SAs also considered efficacy endpoints in trials with high mortality or morbidity, accepted in the authorized protocol by the competent authorities to be treated as a disease-related events and not subject to the systemic unblinding. And SARs that are expected for similar products within the therapeutic class, which did not occur in subject taking the IMP. So it's very important that we may have some signals coming just because a drug of the same class is causing a particular reaction. Maybe we might have a scenario wherein we know that, okay, this particular event can happen because of the pharmacological property of the drug. But if we don't have that data from the actual human population, from the clinical trials that have been conducted for that same IMP, that should not be included in the RSI. So all those other things which maybe we anticipate could be a strong signal, they can always be mentioned in the IB, but not in the RSI section. They can be captured in the other sections of the IB, but not in the RSI. Also, there can be scenarios where in the reference safety information may not have the expected SAR. So as I mentioned earlier, even if we have such a scenario wherein the expected SARs are not present, and that would happen. Let's say today, if you're starting a clinical trial phase 1, obviously we will not have any data from the human population. So obviously we would not have any SARs in the RSI, even though we might know that there would be some anticipated adverse reaction that would go into the other sections of the IB. But that particular section of RSI, which has to be specified clearly, that should be clearly called out, and we can clearly call out that, okay, there is no SAR at that moment when we are preparing the report. And of course, as we gradually keep on getting the data, and at the time of the routine annual IB update, or whenever we are updating the IB, we can always update that RSA section, but the section has to be clearly demarcated. And again, this is something very important. I'm emphasizing it again and again because in Europe, the authorities like BFORM and other authorities are very particular that if that section is not clearly called out, they obviously would ask to update the IB again to clearly mention that and demarcate that section. And the other point is that as far as the update is concerned, generally, like when we have to update the IB, annual IB update is good enough. But of course, if there are significant safety concerns which come all of a sudden, in some situations, yes, IB can be updated even more frequently. But as a rule, RSI update can be done at the time of the routine annual IB update. Now, this is a example of a scenario wherein if the RSI has to be prepared, wherein the IMP is a combination of two ingredients, and it may not be a fixed dose combination. Now the point is that if we have such a scenario, first of all, there can be a standard process wherein if we have a RSI which is already prepared for the data which is based on the combination of the IMP or the two active ingredients, and we just basically use that data. But there can be some situation where maybe there is data for the individual active moieties of the overall IMP, and we do not have the combined data. So it is okay to use the data for the two different IMPs, I mean like the two active moieties. But then what needs to be done is, like, if you're doing the expectedness, so if that particular serious adverse event that we are getting, if that SA is, or SAR that we are getting, if it is expected in both the RSIs for the two active moieties, then that particular SA would become expected. Otherwise, if it is just expected in one of the active moiety, it would become unexpected. And if the sponsor does not have the data in the IB or section 4.8 of an SMPC from the clinical trial, which have used the proposed IMP combination, multiple IBs or SMPC, maybe then they can use that individual IMP active moiety RSI, and then that can be that is acceptable. All right, so I think now I would hand over to Dr. Mukta for presenting her part. She will be talking about the procedure for updating the RSI, and she will also talk about the amendments, how the decision is taken, whether the amendment is considered substantial or non-substantial. But before she starts the session, I would briefly give a brief introduction. So Mukta is also the founder and director of Avinsa Life Sciences, and she has more than 16 years of experience, including pharmacovigilance and clinical research. And before joining Avinsa, she was the Associate Vice President for US Pharmacovigilance and Clinical Safety at AFSR in her last role, and she was overseeing the delivery and operation from India, which included but not limited to case processing, aggregate reports, literature monitoring, and signal detection. Before starting with AFSR, she was with Ranbaxy as a manager in the Department of Medical Affairs and Pharmacovigilance, and she comes with an extensive experience in various databases like Argus and RSG for case processing, reporting, and product license management, and also met the challenges of business continuity planning and data restoration. Over to Mukta.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sanjeev, for the nice introduction. And first of all, thanks for discussing in detail about the RSI objectives, where RSI should be located in the IB or SPC, and the format and presentation of the SARs in the RSI. So in my presentation, I will focus on the procedures for update of the RSI during the clinical trials, and if it is considered as substantial or non-substantial. Before I start talking about the procedure for updating the RSI, I would like to briefly touch base upon the CTFG. So Clinical Trial Facilitation Group, that is CTFG, was established to coordinate the implementation of the European Clinical Trial Directive across the member states. And now it is also coordinating the implementation of the new Clinical Trial Regulation 536/2014 across the EU member states as well. So the CTFG acts as a forum for discussion to agree on common principles and processes to be applied throughout the European medicines regulatory network. So reference safety information is one such guidance which was published by CTFG to provide clarity to the sponsors about the expectations of European national competent authorities in relation to the reference safety information for determination of SUSARs for expedited reporting and annual safety reporting in the clinical trials. So as Sanjeev was emphasizing in his presentation, RSI should be a list of medical events that defines which all reactions are expected for investigational medicinal products being administered to the subjects, and so would not require expedited reporting to the regulatory authorities. The expectedness of an adverse reaction is determined by the sponsor in the RSI, and thus should be done from the perspective of the previously observed and not on the basis of what might be anticipated from the pharmacological properties of the medicinal product. Coming now to the procedure for update of the RSIs during the clinical trials. The RSI is either contained in the IB or the summary of product characteristics if the product is already the approved product in the market. So the covering letter submitted with clinical trial application should clearly refer to the RSI which will be used for the investigational medicinal product. The RSI may change during the conduct of the clinical trials, and a very important thing which needs to be considered is that any change in the RSI in the IB should be considered as a substantial amendment. For practical purposes, the changes will be considered substantial if there is an addition of any new serious adverse reaction in the RSI table, or the frequency of the expected SARs which are already presented in the RSI table, they increase. That is, previously it was reported as an uncommon SAR, and now it falls in the category of the common SAR, or previously it was rare and now it is falling in the category of an uncommon SAR. So there is a change in the frequency, which is a significant change. So it should be considered as a substantial amendment. The new regulation for clinical trials in Europe, that is clinical trial regulation, it clearly explains that any change in the RSI should be considered a substantial amendment. And if IB is updated to include the non-serious events or any other event which were not considered as related to the investigational medicine product, all these changes get reflected in the IB in some other sections and not specifically the RSI section, like the guidance for the investigators, and they should not be considered as substantial amendment. So reiterating the fact that a substantial amendment is always required to be submitted if there are changes to the RSI. However, changes to the format of the table that do not affect the expected SARs or slight modification of exposure rates that do not result in change in the category of frequency without addition of any new expected SARs or any new preferred terms classification, they should not be considered as substantial amendments. And the addition of any new expected SAR preferred terms as well as update of the frequency of expected fatal or life-threatening SARs should always be considered as substantial. Any update to the section 4.8 of the SMPC when RSI is a part of SMPC, such as the addition of new term, is considered an update to the RSI and therefore also requires submission as substantial amendment for approval before the RSI can be used to assess the expectedness of suspected SARs. The most important point to be noted here is the notification to the authorities. When we are submitting a substantial amendment that involves an IB or SMPC update, the cover letter, which has to be submitted along with the amendment, that must indicate if the RSI is being updated or not. Upon submission of an IB in a substantial amendment application containing the updated RSI, which is not accompanied by any protocol amendment, the sponsor should specify in the submission cover letter what are the risk mitigation measures. Are they already in place in the protocol to manage any new safety information or any new safety issue which is being updated in the RSI? And if these new safety issues are adequately covered in the subject information leaflet or the informed consent, or the informed consent is required to be updated. So all these details should be captured in the cover letter appropriately during the submission. And references for any parallel DSUR submission should also be given in the cover letter. When we are submitting the IB, a tracked change version of the IB should be provided so the regulators can view the references easily. And in cases where justification for amendments to the RSI are provided in some additional documents, these documents should be submitted simultaneously along with the substantial amendment. So in these situations, substantial amendment application that includes an updated RSI is then submitted. I would like to highlight another important aspect of the RSI update. So when is the RSI update considered appropriate? We have now discussed that RSI is used for assessing expectedness of suspected SARs for the purpose of expedited reporting of SUSARs and for the identification of the SUSARs in the cumulative summary tabulation of serious adverse reactions in the DSURs, which is the annual report for the clinical, for the IMPs. Depending on whether the RSI is contained in the IB or the summary of product characteristics, CTFG explains what to follow if the RSI is within the IB prepared by the sponsor, if the RSI is within IB which is not prepared and updated by the sponsor, and if the RSI is in section 4.8 of the SPC. So if the RSI is within the IB prepared by the sponsor, CTFG highly recommends to update the RSI section of the IB only once a year after the DSUR data log point along with the new DSUR. Cumulative safety data from the preclinical or the clinical development program is reviewed during the annual IB update, and the IB update can take place while preparing the DSUR. That is, IB update always we have 60 days for submission of the DSUR from the data log point. And this is what most companies follow, but in case it is not possible to prepare or update the IB with the DSUR, it should be done as close as possible to the DSUR DLP. So substantial amendments for all the trials that use the IB should be submitted to the authorities in all EU member states where trials are ongoing in parallel to the DSUR submission. The DSUR may include the supportive data for justification as the RSI update. For example, the references may be made to the tables, the line listings or the other data within the DSUR to support a proposal to add an expected SAR. The newly updated RSI should and can only be used for assessing the expectedness of the suspected serious adverse reactions for expedited reporting only and only after the approval of the substantial amendment in all the member states where trials are ongoing. So till the time the approval of the RSI is obtained from all the member states, that particular RSI cannot be used for the assessment of the or determination of the expectedness of the serious adverse reactions. Once it gets approved, then it can be used for the assessment, and then only SUSARs can be reported based on the new RSI. So if additional SUSARs occur before the new RSI is approved, these should be reported as SUSARs in the usual expedited manner. And for the purpose of identification of SUSARs in the cumulative summary tabulation of serious adverse reactions in the DSUR, the version of the RSI which is most recently approved in all member states should be used. So it means that this should be considered to be the RSI in effect at the start of the annual reporting period. So only suspected SARs that are unexpected as per the RSI that was most recently approved should be highlighted as SUSARs in the DSUR, and not any suspected SAR that would have been considered to be SUSAR in previous versions of the RSI. So ICH E2F also clearly says that the RSI used to identify SUSARs in the DSUR should be submitted with the DSUR. So when we are submitting the DSUR, we have to submit the RSI. We have to submit that RSI as well as the proposed new RSI, and any changes to the RSI, they should be detailed in the changes to the reference safety information section of the DSUR. In case the IB has been updated and there are no proposed changes, the new IB, that should still be submitted along with the DSUR. This is an example of the IB RSI update following DSUR reporting period. So this table is taken exactly or directly from the clinical trial facilitation group guidance and is referring to a practical example of which IB to refer to for the assessment of expectedness during the DSUR and the IB update. In this specific example, if we see for a DSUR with reporting period from 1st August to 31st July, IB version 5 was in effect. The annual update of the IB, they should be done in parallel with the preparation of the DSUR. So DSUR due for submission being 60 days from the DLP, that is the report, the DLP of the DSUR being 31st July, so it has to be submitted by around 30th of September. So that has to be submitted by 30th September. And if the RSI section was updated by the sponsor, so IB should be updated to version 6 submitted as a substantial amendment in parallel with the DSUR. So the most recently approved IB, which is IB version 5, should be used as RSI for this DSUR. And both IB version 5 and version 6 should be submitted with the DSUR by 30th September. That is the date of the due date of submission of that DSUR. And for the purpose of SUSAR reporting, IB version 5 will be used, and IB version 6 can only be used as RSI for SUSAR reporting only after the approval is received for that IB version 6 from all the EU member states where clinical trial is ongoing, as we were discussing earlier as well. So say hypothetically, if the approval is received by 30th of November, so it was submitted by 30th of September and the approval is received by 30th of November. So till 30th of November, the previous IB version 5 will be used for the purpose of expedited reporting. Yes, after 30th November, once IB version 6 gets approved, this version, that is version 6 of RSI, should be used for assessment of expectedness for SUSAR reporting. And similarly, next year, in the next cycle of the DSUR, IB version 6 should be used as RSI for expectedness assessment in the reporting period, starting with data log point for all the suspected SARs in the cumulative summary tabulation of serious adverse reaction. Now, referring to the update of the RSI in the IB, which is not prepared and updated by the sponsor itself. That is for non-commercial sponsor using a company's IB. And in these situations, commercial sponsors should have a written agreement in place with the company in which the updated approved IB is sent to the sponsor immediately. If the company has submitted a substantial amendment to authorities in EU member states in relation to the updated IB for any trial for which it is a sponsor, the non-commercial sponsor should await the completion of the assessment of the substantial amendment and submit the approved IB together with any of the necessary amendments to the protocol as a substantial amendment for their own clinical trial. Now, coming to the third point, third recommendation by CTFG, if the RSI is in section 4.8 of the SMPC and this section is updated during the trial, it is recommended by CTFG to submit a substantial amendment requesting approval of the update to the RSI immediately following completion of the variation procedure. And following approval of the SMPC for use as RSI in all member states where the trial is ongoing, the updated SMPC should be used for purpose of expedited reporting. So as to say, when expected SARs are newly added to the RSI contained in the IB or SMPC, the sponsor should also update the subject information leaflet or the informed consent form if it is required to be updated. There can be situations when there is an update to the IB with new safety information without any change to the RSI. And this kind of scenario generally happens during the annual IB update. For example, some non-serious events get added during the annual IB update, or some tables get updated with the safety information in some sections. So like in the section for effect in humans, or the sections for the guidance for investigators. So tables can be added for serious or non-serious events and related or not related events. So however, these can be updated, but the RSI section of the IB should only be updated following the DSUR reporting period and ideally should be submitted in parallel with the DSUR is what the guidance say. So in a nutshell, RSI update is required to be done in case there is any addition of a new serious adverse reaction or increase in frequency of already expected SARs. However, the safety data can be updated in other sections of the IB irrespective of any changes requested to be done in the RSI. Another very important question is, does the IB have to be amended if RSI is not a clearly identified section in the current approved IB used for the ongoing clinical trials? So answer to this question is yes. If the RSI is within the IB for an IMP and there is not yet a clearly identified section for the RSI where all the expected SARs are included in the form of a table, an RSI section should be included in the IB at the next routine update and a substantial amendment should be submitted. Until the RSI section is clearly identified in an approved version of the IB, all suspected SARs should be reported as SUSARs. So basically the assessment of the SUSARs or assessment of the reportability, it all depends on the RSI sections, which is generally in the section 6.4 of the IB. From regulatory reporting perspective, and imperative point is which version of RSI should be used for determining RSI. The time of occurrence of the suspected serious adverse reaction should always be used to assess expectedness for follow-up reports to eudravigilance. And SUSARs should not be downgraded in eudravigilance on the basis that the RSI was updated after the occurrence of the event. So if we are having an SAR which becomes expected of the RSI, this is all what I have in the presentation today. So I can, I will now open the floor for questions, and we'll be most happy to answer the questions.
So there are several questions that came in, very good questions. One is, how is the causality taken into account in determination of expected SARs, and which all options of causality are taken into account in preparing the expected SARs?
Sure, Sharon. So I'll take that question. The causality has an important role to play when we are preparing the RSA section of the IB. And if we go by the WHO classification criteria, or maybe any kind of classification, if we know that if we have cases which are, say, probably related, wherein we know that there is a higher chance of the drug to be implicated and the other factors are less likely to be implicated, or maybe if we know that is definitely related. So obviously when we make a decision of probable association or definite association, it means that we are having some scenarios where rechallenge could be positive or rechallenge is positive, or maybe there is a good temporal association, and we are able to rule out other factors. So in those kind of situations where we have some cases wherein there is a reasonable causal association, and if there are events which are more than one, I mean the serious adverse reactions which are more than one, so they would be kind of included in the RSI. But then say if we are having cases which are unlikely related or not related, so obviously those kind of cases would not be considered to be related, so they would not become a part of RSI. So just to summarize, basically causality is very important. So as and when we get any cases during the course of the clinical trial, we do our assessment, and at the time of IB update or during our quarterly cycle, we make an assessment. Okay, how many cases are there which are serious adverse reaction, which are either possibly related or probable or definite. So obviously the ones which are falling into the probable category or certain category. So if I have, say, something more than two which are certain, that would warrant inclusion in the RSI, or for that matter, even if it is probable, but if it is, say, more than one, and if there is a reasonable association, so that would be included in the RSI.
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev. Another question, how are synonymous medical terms handled in the RSI?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. In fact, CTFG guidance document does talk about the synonymous medical terms also. And I'll give you an example. Maybe if we, say, get a case of pneumonia, and our SPC or our IB mentions pneumonia, but then we may get cases of right upper lobar pneumonia or middle lobe pneumonia. Now that would not be a different medical concept. Ultimately, the basic pathology is the consolidation that's happening in the lung, or the inflammation that's happening in the lung. So that anatomical specification would not make a specific difference in this scenario, at least. So when we are having the synonymous terms, which means the same medical concept, then we don't have to capture every time a second term in the RSI, and pneumonia itself can suffice the purpose. But then there can be situations when there can be a different medical phenomena. Maybe we might have some patients who are having, say, maculopapular rash. Some patient might be having pustular rash or papular rash. Now, etiologies of these kind of different types of rash could be different. And in fact, CTFG guidance classically gives this example. So these are basically the scenarios for different medical phenomena. So when we are getting these kind of different preferred terms with the different medical phenomena. So then they have to be listed in the RSI separately. But if the medical concept is same, like the example that I gave for pneumonia, then we should not write these different type of medical terms separately in the RSI. Even a single term of pneumonia in that scenario would be okay. But if the medical phenomena is different, the term should be mentioned separately in the RSI.
Is the IB amendment considered to be substantial if the non-serious events are added to the IB?
Sure. Thank you, Sharon. I will take this question. So IB amendment, and in fact, this is a very good question, which we, in fact, were discussing in the presentation as well. So IB amendment, in case there is any update in the non-serious events, so these can be added in any other section of the IB. So IB amendment will only be considered as substantial if there is an update in the RSI, which is the addition of any new suspected SARs or increase in the frequency of the already existing SARs. So that is how the classification of the categorization of the IB amendment being it substantial or non-substantial is given. In case there is an addition to the non-serious events which might anyways happen because of the updated safety information in the IB. So in that situation, whenever the non-serious events get added in some of the other sections of the IB, so they shall not be considered as substantial amendment.
Thanks, Magda. In the RSI update, are only those serious adverse events taken into account which are considered to be related by the investigator?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon. I can again take this. Yes, so RSI update or RSI section will have the events which are considered as related, definitely. So any thing which is related will only get captured, and serious and related will only be captured in the RSI section. But the most important point which has to be considered here is that the sponsor plays also a very important role here in assessment of causality, because sponsor is the one who is assessing the safety data for that particular IMP across the course of the clinical trial. And in case the sponsor considers that there is a strong rationale for some of the events to be added in the RSI because they are causally related, so yes, they have to be added in fact they can be added in the RSI with the proper justification why we are adding that in the RSI section. So yes, to answer the question, only the related events have to be added, but it is not just by the investigator. Sponsor has to play a very important role, and when they see that the assessment of causality, what they do after reviewing whole of the data for the investigational medicinal product, these can be updated based on their assessment.
Thanks, Magda. Is the RSI required in the IB even at the time of the CTA filing?
Yes, again, I can again take this. Thank you so much, Sharon, for moderating and asking the question. So yeah, the RSI is required at the time of CTA filing. Whenever a clinical trial application is filed, the RSI is definitely required. And at the same time, we totally understand, and Sanjeev was explaining in his presentation as well, that in the early course of the clinical trial, you might not be having enough data, or there might not be any expected SAR. Right, but even for that particular scenario, the clinical trial application has to have the RSI section. I mean, they have to completely present in the cover letter that the RSI section, which is the section of the RSI, and during that, whenever there is in the early development program or maybe the phase 2 program, in case there is no expected SAR, there is no RSI table, so that should be clearly documented in the IB that there is no expected SAR for this IMP for the purpose of expedited reporting or the DSUR reporting. So that has to be clearly mentioned in the IB for the at the time of the clinical trial application filing.
Okay, thanks, Magda. A couple other questions that are great as well. Can a fatal event be considered as expected SAR in the RSI if it occurs more than once?
Sure, Sharon. I can take this question. So yes, then on an exceptional basis, of course, the fatal events can be considered as expected. Generally, as a rule, CTFG guidance document mentions that they should not be considered expected unless there is a reason to believe that there is a strong causal association and in case the other confounding factors can be clearly ruled out in the cases, and if there is no other reason for the fatal reaction to happen, then of course in those kind of scenarios, if the cases are happening, in fact in those kind of scenarios where if it is a single case, there could always be a justification that can be given by the sponsor, but generally these things do not happen, and fatal and life-threatening events generally would not be considered expected, but yes, exceptions can happen.
And one last question, I think, for you, Sanjeev. Should we report serious expected reactions? And what does regulatory guidelines in India, US, and the EU say?
Well, the US and EU are very clear. In fact, in all the European countries, in the US, and in fact most of the countries, it's only the SUSAR that is required to be reported, which is suspected serious unexpected adverse reaction, and that's why the role of expectancy assessment comes into the picture. But yes, there are some countries like in India, they need everything, like all serious adverse events. So there are some countries who require all serious adverse event irrespective of expectedness. But yes, that would be some fraction. But most of the countries, like especially in the US and the European countries, they would typically require SUSAR. So the events have to be unexpected and serious and related.
Well, that ends the questions we have.
Great. All right, so I think then if we have no more questions, and I know it's already 12:07 EST, so I think then we can close the session, Sharon. I hope we have covered all the questions so far.
So thanks everyone for your participation and questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Sharon. Thanks Mumta. Bye. Bye everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.